The silence did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust in a workshop after the tools have been put away, after the cameras stopped rolling, after the familiar rhythm of voices was replaced by something heavier and harder to name. For years, viewers had grown accustomed to seeing warmth on screen, gentle humor, the sense that broken things could be made whole again with patience and care. Then, without warning, that comforting world fractured. Headlines appeared. Episodes vanished. A familiar face was suddenly absent, and the absence itself became the loudest sound of all. In moments like this, people look for signs. Not official statements or carefully worded press releases, but something human. A glance, a gesture, a photograph that feels unguarded. When Steve Fletcher appeared, smiling beside Jay Blades, it was not just an image. It felt like a disruption. A quiet challenge to the expectation that everyone would step back, look away, and wait for the storm to pass. The photograph did not explain itself. It did not justify or condemn. It simply existed, and that was enough to ignite conversation. For fans of the repair shop, the image carried weight because it cut through a narrative that had already hardened. Jay Blades had become a name surrounded by controversy, a person discussed more in legal terms than human ones. The BBC had removed episodes, broadcasters had shifted schedules, and the tone around him had changed from affection to caution. Silence, in that context, became a form of distance. And distance, many assumed, meant abandonment. When Steve chose visibility instead, it unsettled those assumptions. There was something disarmingly ordinary about what Steve shared. Conversation. A pause in the middle of a tour to sit with a friend. No dramatic language. No defiance. Just the suggestion of normalcy at a time when normal life seemed impossible for one of the people involved. That contrast is what made the moment feel electric. In a media environment trained to amplify extremes, quiet loyalty can feel radical. The story does not begin with scandal, though that is where many encountered it. It begins much earlier, in a workshop where timepieces were taken apart and reassembled, where patience was valued, where mistakes were treated as part of learning rather than failure. Over 7 years, viewers watched relationships form in that space. Some were professional, some were polite, and some felt deeper, marked by ease rather than performance. Steve and Jay belonged to the last category. Their exchanges were not scripted to feel intimate. They simply were. When allegations surfaced against Jay, the dissonance was immediate. The public image of empathy and care clashed with accusations that suggested control, fear, and harm. For audiences, that clash was deeply unsettling. It raised uncomfortable questions about how well anyone can know a person, especially one shaped by television. For colleagues, it posed a different dilemma. What does loyalty look like when the stakes are this high? When support can be misread as approval? When silence can be mistaken for judgment or fear? Steve's decision to be seen with Jay did not resolve those questions. Instead, it sharpened them. Some interpreted his actions as a necessary reminder of the presumption of innocence, of the difference between allegations and verdicts. Others saw risk, worrying that any public association might soften the seriousness of the accusations. The image became a mirror, reflecting the viewer's own beliefs about friendship, accountability, and moral responsibility. What makes this moment resonate is not certainty, but tension. Steve did not offer answers. He did not attempt to control the narrative. He allowed his choice to speak for itself, knowing it would be interpreted in countless ways. In doing so, he stepped into a space that many avoid, where there is no safe position, only trade-offs. Career security versus personal loyalty. Public approval versus private conviction. Silence versus presence. In the background, the world of the repair shop continued. The workshop doors opened. Other experts carried on. Objects were restored, stories were shared, and the format endured. Yet the absence lingered, and with it, the sense that something essential had been lost, not just a presenter, but a chapter of a shared story. Steve's visit did not restore that chapter. It did something quieter. It reminded people that relationships do not always follow institutional logic, and that human bonds often survive in the spaces where public narratives break down. This is why the image mattered, not because it revealed a secret, but because it confirmed a feeling many had carried for years. That behind the cameras, beyond the scripts and schedules, there was a real friendship shaped by shared time, trust, and mutual respect. In moments of calm, such friendships are easy to overlook. In moments of crisis, they become visible, and their visibility forces difficult conversations. As the legal process continues and uncertainty stretches forward, the photograph remains suspended in time, a single moment of connection in a period defined by division. It does not resolve guilt or innocence. It does not undo harm or erase fear. What it does is raise a question that cannot be ignored. When someone we know is accused of something deeply troubling, what does it mean to stand beside them? Is it an act of courage, a moral failing, or something far more complicated than either label allows? Long before controversy reshaped how his name appeared in headlines, Jay Blades lived a life defined by movement, instability, and the constant need to adapt. His childhood was not framed by predictability or security, but by change. Growing up in London, he learned early how environments shape people, how survival often requires reading a room quickly and adjusting without complaint. Those early years planted in him a heightened awareness of others, an instinct to connect, to disarm tension with humor, to make people feel seen even when he himself felt uncertain about where he belonged. Education never followed a straight path. Jay struggled in formal academic settings, often describing himself as someone who learned better by doing than by sitting still. That sense of being out of place lingered well into adulthood, pushing him toward practical work, craftsmanship, and eventually a deeper appreciation for trades that relied on hands as much as minds. Woodworking became more than a skill. It became a form of grounding, a way to impose order on chaos, to take raw materials and turn them into something useful, something meaningful. Steve Fletcher's story unfolded along a very different trajectory. Precision, patience, and routine were not learned traits for him, but foundational ones. Trained as a horologist, Steve's world revolved around time, not as an abstract concept, but as a physical force measured in gears, springs, and escapements. His workshop was a place of quiet focus, where each movement mattered and mistakes carried consequences measured in seconds lost or gained. Trust was central to his work. People handed him objects that carried generations of memory, and he treated them with reverence. When the repair shop brought these two men together, the contrast was immediately visible. Jay arrived as a presenter with enthusiasm and emotional openness, but limited technical knowledge. Steve stood as an authority in his field, reserved, meticulous, and deeply rooted in tradition. On paper, they occupied separate roles. In practice, those differences created a balance that neither could have engineered alone. Behind the scenes, their dynamic developed slowly. Jay watched more than he spoke in those early days, hovering near benches, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than performative interest. Steve, accustomed to solitude, found himself explaining not just how clocks worked, but why they mattered. He spoke about patience, about listening to a mechanism before touching it, about respecting the intent of craftsmen long gone. Jay absorbed these lessons with an attentiveness that surprised those who assumed his role was purely presentational. Their conversations extended beyond filming schedules. During breaks, they spoke about backgrounds, about failure, about the pressure of being perceived in ways that did not always align with reality. Jay shared stories of feeling underestimated, of being dismissed early in his career. Steve spoke less, but when he did, it was with clarity, describing the quiet burden of expertise and the expectation of perfection that followed him everywhere. In those exchanges, a mutual respect formed, rooted not in television roles, but in shared vulnerability. As the show gained popularity, that respect translated on screen into something audiences instinctively recognized. Jay deferred to Steve's knowledge without diminishing his own presence. Steve, in turn, seemed more at ease explaining complex ideas, knowing Jay would translate them for viewers without distorting their meaning. Their rapport did not rely on scripted banter. It emerged from trust built over time, reinforced by countless small moments that never made it into the final edit. Outside the workshop, both men carried private pressures. Fame arrived unevenly and unpredictably. For Jay, visibility amplified scrutiny. His public persona as a warm, empathetic host became both an asset and a constraint, leaving little room for complexity or contradiction. For Steve, recognition disrupted a life structured around quiet craftsmanship. Invitations, tours, and public appearances pulled him away from the controlled environment where he felt most grounded. Yet even as their professional lives expanded, their connection remained anchored in something simpler. Shared cups of tea after long filming days. Conversations about the responsibility that came with telling other people's stories. Reflections on how objects could carry grief, love, and unresolved memory. These were not the kinds of exchanges that generate headlines, but they form the backbone of enduring friendships. It is within this context that later events take on deeper meaning. When audiences eventually questioned what was happening behind the scenes, they were responding to more than speculation. They were reacting to years of subtle cues that suggested a bond extending beyond contractual obligation. The ease with which Steve and Jay occupied the same space, the way silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, hinted at a relationship shaped by familiarity and trust. Understanding that past does not explain away future actions or allegations. It does, however, illuminate why a single photograph could resonate so strongly. It was not an isolated gesture. It was the visible continuation of a relationship forged long before cameras and controversy intervened. A relationship shaped by shared work, mutual learning, and the slow accumulation of moments that rarely announce their significance until they are tested. This background matters because it complicates easy judgments. It challenges the idea that relationships are purely situational or disposable when circumstances change. It reveals how loyalty is often rooted not in ideology, but in memory, in who someone was to you before the world began watching more closely. As the story moves forward, the weight of this shared past lingers beneath every interpretation, every reaction, every debate about what support should look like in times of crisis. It reminds us that public narratives often flatten lives that are anything but simple, and that the choices people make in moments of pressure are rarely detached from the histories that shape them. The shift from quiet routine to public rupture did not happen overnight, but when it came, it felt sudden and irreversible. What had once been a steady rhythm of filming schedules, familiar faces, and predictable creative flow gave way to uncertainty, as if a fault line had opened beneath everything that had seemed stable. For Jay Blades, the pressure had been building long before it surfaced publicly. Those closest to him later described subtle changes, moments of distraction, a heaviness that lingered even when the cameras were off. None of it was dramatic enough to raise alarms at the time. In retrospect, it reads differently. When the allegations emerged, they arrived not as a whisper, but as a blunt disruption. Legal language replaced the language of restoration and care. Headlines spoke of control, fear, and coercion, terms that sat uneasily beside the image of a man whose television presence had been defined by warmth and reassurance. The contrast was jarring, not only for audiences, but for colleagues who had spent years working alongside him in an environment built on trust. Suddenly, every memory was filtered through doubt. Every smile replayed with a question attached. The immediate consequences were swift and visible. Episodes disappeared from schedules. Projects that had once seemed secure were paused or quietly altered. Invitations stopped coming. The silence that followed was not empty, but charged, filled with speculation and anxiety. For Jay, the sense of isolation intensified. The public version of his life had collapsed into fragments, while the private one was consumed by legal strategy, court dates, and the relentless uncertainty of what lay ahead. Friends became careful. Messages were shorter. Conversations felt weighed down by what could not be said. In that atmosphere, the smallest gestures took on outsized meaning. A visit, a conversation, a photograph. When Steve Fletcher stepped into this space, he did so fully aware of the risks. He understood the climate he was entering, one shaped by heightened sensitivity and zero tolerance for perceived missteps. Allegations of this nature do not allow for neutrality. Any association can be read as a statement, whether intended or not. What made Steve's choice particularly striking was its timing. The legal process was unresolved. Public opinion was fractured and volatile. There was no safe window in which support could be offered without consequence. Yet he chose presence over distance, connection over silence. Not loudly, not defiantly, but plainly. He went for tea. He talked. He listened. And then he allowed that moment to be seen. Behind that decision lay a complex emotional calculus. Steve was not responding to headlines or social media commentary. He was responding to a person he knew through years of shared work, shared stress, and shared purpose. He had witnessed Jay in moments the public never saw, moments of doubt, learning, and growth. That personal knowledge did not erase the seriousness of the allegations, but it shaped how Steve navigated his response. He did not attempt to reinterpret events or offer explanations. He did not speak on behalf of anyone else. He simply maintained a relationship. For many observers, that distinction was difficult to accept. In a culture increasingly shaped by absolutes, nuance is often treated with suspicion. Support is conflated with endorsement. Silence is mistaken for judgment. Steve's actions sat uncomfortably between these binaries, refusing to resolve into something easily labeled. Some saw courage, a refusal to abandon a friend in his darkest hour. Others saw recklessness, a failure to acknowledge the gravity of the accusations. Both interpretations revealed more about the viewer than the act itself. The professional stakes were real and immediate. Steve's career had been built on credibility, trust, and a reputation for integrity. He worked with objects that carried immense emotional value, and people trusted him implicitly with irreplaceable pieces of their history. That trust extended to his public image. Any perception that he was minimizing or overlooking serious harm could erode the foundation of his work. Sponsors, venues, and broadcasters operate within their own risk frameworks, often guided by public sentiment as much as principle. Steve knew this. He also knew that retreating into silence would be safer. Yet safety was not the value guiding his choice. Those who know him well have often described his worldview as restorative rather than punitive. Broken mechanisms are not discarded. They are examined, understood, and, where possible, repaired. This philosophy, so central to his craft, appeared to extend into his personal ethics. Supporting a friend, in his mind, did not require dismissing the pain of others or preempting legal outcomes. It required presence without judgment, loyalty without commentary. For Jay, that presence carried immense emotional weight. In a period defined by loss of status, routine, and certainty, being treated as a human rather than a headline mattered. It did not change the legal realities he faced, but it countered the erasure that often accompanies scandal. The knowledge that someone who knew him deeply was willing to sit with him, publicly and without apology, offered a form of stability when everything else felt precarious. The broader impact of this moment rippled outward. Fans revisited old episodes, noticing interactions that now seemed charged with new significance. Glances, pauses, shared laughter were reinterpreted through the lens of loyalty and betrayal. Comment sections filled with debates not about the facts of the case, but about moral responsibility, friendship, and the limits of compassion. The story shifted from being solely about allegations to being about how people respond to them. What is often lost in these discussions is the cost of uncertainty. Legal processes move slowly, leaving those involved suspended in a state of prolonged limbo. Lives do not pause neatly while verdicts are pending. Relationships are strained, identities questioned, futures reshaped. In this space, every action is provisional, every decision shadowed by outcomes that cannot yet be known. Steve's choice did not claim certainty. It acknowledged uncertainty and acted within it. As the case moved forward and time stretched on without resolution, the photograph remained a fixed point, a reminder of a choice made under pressure without guarantees. It neither redeemed nor condemned. It simply existed as evidence of a relationship that refused to be defined solely by crisis. For some, that was unsettling. For others, it was deeply human. The tension at the heart of this moment lies in its refusal to simplify. It resists the demand for clean narratives and easy heroes or villains. It forces an uncomfortable recognition that people can hold conflicting truths at once. That care and harm can coexist in complex ways. That loyalty does not always align neatly with public expectations. As the legal proceedings continue and their outcomes remain uncertain, this chapter of the story does not close. It lingers, asking questions rather than providing answers. About how we judge those we know through screens. About how we balance accountability with compassion. About what it means to stand beside someone when standing apart would be easier. The consequences unfolded quietly at first, then all at once. They did not arrive as a single dramatic collapse, but as a series of withdrawals, pauses, and recalibrations that reshaped lives in ways not always visible to the public eye. For Jay Blades, the most immediate impact was the sudden narrowing of his world. Opportunities that once flowed freely were replaced by restrictions, legal consultations, and a calendar defined not by filming schedules but by court-related uncertainty. The work that had given structure and meaning to his days was no longer accessible, and with that loss came an erosion of identity that no statement or reassurance could easily repair. The professional consequences extended beyond the individual. The repair shop had long been marketed as a safe, restorative space, a program rooted in empathy and continuity. Removing a central figure disrupted more than programming logistics. It altered the emotional architecture of the show. Producers were forced to make decisions under pressure, balancing ethical responsibility, public expectation, and the need to protect a format that had become beloved precisely because it felt insulated from the harsher edges of reality. Episodes were quietly pulled, schedules adjusted, and an unspoken understanding settled over the production that things could not return to how they were, regardless of eventual outcomes. For the remaining cast, the situation introduced a new kind of strain. Silence became a protective measure, not necessarily a moral stance. Speaking risked misinterpretation. Staying quiet risked appearing complicit or indifferent. Each individual navigated this terrain differently, guided by personal values, legal advice, and an acute awareness of how fragile reputations can be in moments of public scrutiny. Relationships that once thrived in shared creative energy were now filtered through caution. The ripple effects reached audiences as well. Viewers who had invested years in the emotional rhythms of the show experienced a sense of dislocation. Familiar episodes felt altered in retrospect, their warmth shadowed by knowledge that could not be unlearned. Trust, once extended easily, became conditional. Online discussions revealed a fracture within the fan base, some clinging to the comfort the show had provided, others unable to separate that comfort from the discomfort of the allegations. The show continued, but its reception was no longer uncomplicated. Amid this shifting landscape, Steve Fletcher faced consequences of a different kind. His decision to maintain visible contact with Jay did not result in immediate professional collapse, but it introduced an undercurrent of risk that lingered beneath his ongoing work. Invitations were weighed more carefully. Public appearances carried an added layer of scrutiny. Questions that once centered on craftsmanship and heritage now included unspoken assessments of judgment and alignment. Even neutrality was no longer neutral. The emotional toll on Steve was less visible, but no less real. Loyalty, once a private value, had become a public statement. Each interaction, each silence, was interpreted through a lens he could not control. The patience that defined his craft was tested by a situation that offered no clear resolution and no timeline for closure. Supporting a friend did not shield him from the weight of criticism, nor did it absolve him from self-doubt. He was required to live with ambiguity, to accept that his intentions might never be universally understood. Beyond individual careers, the situation highlighted the broader cost of scandal within public institutions. BBC, like many organizations, operates under intense scrutiny, particularly when allegations intersect with issues of personal conduct. Its response, swift and decisive, was designed to signal accountability and protect public trust. Yet such actions also carry collateral consequences, shaping narratives and relationships in ways that extend far beyond official statements. The removal of content, while necessary for some, reinforced a sense of erasure for others, complicating perceptions of fairness and proportionality. Socially, the aftermath revealed how quickly communities recalibrate around controversy. Some friends stepped back, unsure how to reconcile past experiences with present accusations. Others offered private support, choosing discretion over visibility. For Jay, this uneven landscape of connection amplified feelings of isolation. Public opinion, once a source of affirmation, became unpredictable and often hostile. Even expressions of neutrality felt charged, as if withholding judgment were itself a judgment. The long-term consequences remain unresolved. Legal processes move deliberately, but reputational damage operates on a different timeline. Regardless of verdicts, perceptions formed in moments of crisis often persist. Careers can be rebuilt, but rarely in their original shape. Relationships can endure, but they are altered by the pressure they survive. For those involved, the question is no longer how to return to what was, but how to move forward with what remains. Perhaps the most enduring impact lies in how this episode reshapes understanding of public figures. It exposes the tension between the personas crafted for audiences and the complex realities behind them. It challenges the assumption that warmth on screen equates to simplicity off it, or that professional alignment guarantees moral clarity. In doing so, it forces a reckoning not only for those directly involved, but for viewers asked to confront their own expectations. As time passes, the immediate shock fades, replaced by quieter, more persistent questions about accountability and compassion, about the limits of loyalty, about whether institutions and individuals can respond to crisis without flattening the humanity of those involved. The answers are neither quick nor comfortable. They emerge slowly, shaped by outcomes yet unknown and choices still unfolding. There are moments that never reach headlines, moments that exist only in memory and quiet confession. Long before public controversy forced every interaction into the open, there were private scenes that defined the relationship far more truthfully than any photograph ever could. These were not dramatic gestures or carefully staged encounters. They were ordinary, almost invisible, yet they carried the emotional weight that later made Steve Fletcher's choice feel inevitable rather than surprising. In the workshop, after filming wrapped and the lights dimmed, Jay Blades often lingered. He would sit on the edge of a bench, hands folded, watching Steve work even when there was no longer a reason to stay. Sometimes he asked questions. Other times he simply observed in silence, absorbing the rhythm of someone fully immersed in their craft. Steve noticed this early on. He recognized the difference between curiosity performed for cameras and curiosity that comes from a need to understand. Jay's questions were rarely about technique alone. They were about why patience mattered, how to cope with mistakes, how to sit with frustration without letting it turn into anger. These exchanges were never framed as mentorship, but that is what they became. Jay, whose public role required constant engagement, found something grounding in the stillness of clock repair. Steve, who had spent most of his career working alone, found an unexpected listener in Jay. Their conversations drifted beyond the mechanics of timepieces into reflections on pressure, expectation, and the loneliness that can accompany public success. Jay spoke openly about the exhaustion of being perceived as endlessly positive, about how difficult it was to admit uncertainty when millions expected reassurance. Steve listened without interruption, offering few words, but his presence alone seemed to steady the space between them. Away from the workshop, these quieter moments continued. After particularly emotional restorations, when owners shared stories of loss and grief, Jay sometimes struggled more than viewers realized. He carried those stories home with him, replaying them late into the night. On more than one occasion, he reached out to Steve, not for advice, but simply to talk. Steve never treated these calls as interruptions. He understood the cost of emotional labor, even if his own work expressed it differently. He spoke about clocks that stopped after a death, about objects that seemed to grieve alongside their owners. In those conversations, Jay found language for feelings he could not easily express elsewhere. As Jay's personal life grew more complicated, the cracks were visible only to a few. Colleagues later recalled moments when his usual ease faltered, when laughter arrived a beat too late, or enthusiasm felt forced. These are not confessions, just signals. Steve noticed them, not because he was searching for signs, but because years of careful observation had trained him to recognize subtle shifts. He did not confront Jay or press for explanations. Instead, he maintained consistency. The same tone, the same openness, the same quiet respect. In that steadiness, Jay found something rare, a relationship not contingent on performance. There were also moments of frustration, moments when Jay questioned his own worth beyond the screen. He spoke about feeling unprepared, about fearing that his role could be taken away at any moment. Steve responded not with reassurance, but with perspective. He reminded Jay that skills can be learned, that curiosity counts, that respect for craft is itself a form of competence. These conversations were never recorded. They did not fit into a narrative of success or failure. They lived in the margins, shaping a bond that would later be tested under far harsher conditions. When the allegations eventually surfaced, those private histories did not disappear. They resurfaced in memory, complicating the simple stories people wanted to tell. Steve did not see only the man described in court documents or news reports. He also saw the colleague who stayed late to listen, the friend who struggled quietly, the person who had shown genuine care for stories that were not his own. This did not negate the seriousness of the accusations, but it made withdrawal feel like a betrayal of something deeply human. Other voices, less visible, echoed similar sentiments. A few colleagues, speaking anonymously, later suggested that Jay had always been more complex than his public image allowed. They described moments of generosity that never reached cameras, times when he supported crew members through personal crises, gestures that were neither strategic nor performative. These accounts did not excuse anything. They simply added texture to a narrative that risked becoming flat and unforgiving. For Steve, the decision to maintain contact was shaped by these memories. It was not a calculation made in the heat of controversy, but the continuation of a pattern established long before. Loyalty, in his view, was not about defending actions or rejecting accountability. It was about refusing to erase a person based solely on a single chapter, however serious that chapter might be. He believed that people are more than their worst moments, even when those moments demand scrutiny and consequence. The quiet support Steve offered did not come without internal conflict. He wrestled privately with doubt, aware that compassion could be misread as complicity. He considered the impact on his own reputation, the trust placed in him by audiences and institutions. Yet each time he weighed these concerns against his personal knowledge of Jay, he returned to the same conclusion. Abandonment would not make the situation more just. Silence would not heal anyone. presence, however limited, felt more honest. These unspoken stories form the emotional backbone of the moment that later captured public attention. Without them, a photograph looks like a provocation. With them, it looks like continuity, a small, human act rooted in years of shared experience that never asked to be judged by strangers. In the end, these quiet chapters do not offer answers. They offer context. They remind us that relationships are built in spaces far removed from scandal, and that the choices people make in crisis are often shaped by histories the public never sees. Whether those choices are right or wrong remains a matter of debate. What cannot be denied is that they emerge from lives lived in complexity, not slogans or headlines. What remains after the noise fades is not a verdict, not a headline, but a question about meaning. When careers fracture and reputations strain under the weight of accusation, the language of legacy becomes unavoidable. For some, legacy is a list of accomplishments preserved intact. For others, it is something more fragile, shaped by how a person acts when certainty collapses and the future narrows. In this story, legacy is not a fixed monument. It is a moving thing, altered by time, memory, and the choices made under pressure. Jay Blades built a public identity around repair, care, and the restoration of meaning. He became a symbol of reassurance, someone who stood between loss and renewal and made that space feel safe. That image was not an accident. It was cultivated through countless interactions, many unseen, where empathy mattered as much as skill. When allegations surfaced, that image did not simply crack. It shattered into fragments that could not be easily reassembled. For audiences, the rupture felt personal, as though a shared belief had been challenged. For Jay, it forced a confrontation with the limits of persona. The legacy he had crafted through years of work suddenly seemed out of his control. Steve Fletcher's legacy, by contrast, had always been quieter, measured in precision, in trust earned one object at a time, in the patience required to bring something broken back to life without erasing its history. His reputation rested on consistency rather than visibility. When he chose to remain present in Jay's life, he extended that philosophy beyond the workshop. He treated friendship not as a performance to be evaluated, but as a commitment shaped by time and shared experience. In doing so, he accepted that his own legacy might be complicated by association. The tension between these two legacies reveals something larger about how society understands character. Public culture often demands coherence, a clean alignment between image and action. When that alignment breaks, the response is frequently binary: elevation or erasure, celebration or condemnation. What this moment exposes is how ill-suited those binaries are to real human lives. People contain contradictions. They can offer comfort and cause harm. They can be generous in one context and deeply flawed in another. Legacy, then, is not a single story but a contested space where multiple truths coexist. For those who follow the repair shop, the show's deeper promise was never simply about fixing objects. It was about continuity, about honoring what came before while making room for what comes next. That promise now sits uneasily beside the reality of unresolved allegations and fractured trust. The program continues, the workshop doors open, but the emotional resonance has shifted. Viewers watch with greater awareness, carrying questions they did not have before. In that sense, the legacy of the show itself has evolved. It is no longer insulated from the complexities it once gently framed. Steve's decision invites reflection on the kind of legacy forged through restraint rather than declaration. He did not issue manifestos or attempt to redefine public morality. He acted according to values formed long before cameras were involved. That choice does not resolve the moral questions at the heart of the situation, but it reframes them. It suggests that standing by someone does not require certainty about outcomes, only clarity about one's own principles. Whether those principles will be vindicated or criticized is secondary to the act of living by them. There is also a quieter legacy at play, one less visible but no less significant. The legacy of how people treat one another in moments when there is no script, no applause, no assurance of approval. These moments rarely make history books, yet they shape lives profoundly. For Jay, the knowledge that someone remained present may influence how he endures the long stretch of uncertainty ahead. For Steve, the experience will likely remain a defining chapter, not because of external reaction, but because of the internal reckoning it required. As time passes, legal processes will move toward resolution. Facts will be weighed, judgments rendered, consequences assigned. Those outcomes will matter. They will shape careers, reputations, and public memory. But they will not erase the human dimension of what has already occurred. The weeks of silence, the conversations behind closed doors, the decisions made without knowing how they would be received. These elements will persist, woven into personal narratives that exist alongside official records. Legacy, in this light, is less about being remembered favorably and more about being remembered accurately. Not as a symbol flattened by expectation, but as a person acting within constraints, guided by imperfect knowledge and deeply held values. This story resists neat conclusions because it reflects that reality. It asks whether compassion and accountability must always be opposites, or whether they can coexist in uneasy balance. It challenges the assumption that loyalty is inherently virtuous or inherently suspect, suggesting instead that its meaning depends on context, intention, and consequence. In the end, what lingers is not certainty but reflection, on how quickly public narratives harden, on how slowly trust is built, and how swiftly it can be questioned, on the courage it sometimes takes to remain human when the world demands positions rather than presence. These reflections form a legacy of their own, one that extends beyond any individual, inviting anyone who encounters this story to examine where they might stand if faced with similar choices. As the story draws toward its quiet close, there is no single image that can fully contain what has unfolded. There is no decisive moment that resolves every question or restores what was lost. Instead, there's a lingering sense of incompleteness, a recognition that some stories do not end cleanly, but continue to echo long after the public has moved on. What remains is not certainty, but atmosphere, a space filled with memory, doubt, loyalty, and the weight of choices made when there was no safe direction to turn. For those who once found comfort in familiar rhythms and gentle narratives, this chapter leaves a different kind of imprint. It asks the viewer to sit with discomfort rather than relief, to accept that people are not defined solely by their best moments, nor erased entirely by their worst. It challenges the desire for simple moral alignment and replaces it with something harder, a recognition of complexity that resists resolution. In doing so, it mirrors real life far more closely than any polished storyline ever could. Jay Blades now exists in the public imagination in fragments. The warmth that once defined him has not vanished, but it has been overshadowed by questions that cannot be ignored. His future, both personal and professional, remains uncertain, shaped by legal outcomes yet to be determined and perceptions already formed. Whether he will return to public life in a meaningful way is unknown. What is clear is that whatever comes next will not resemble what came before. The innocence of uncomplicated admiration is gone, replaced by a more cautious, fractured understanding. Steve Fletcher's role in this story does not offer closure either. His decision to remain present did not fix anything. It did not heal wounds or resolve conflicts. What it did was reveal something about character that exists beyond approval or condemnation. In choosing presence over absence, he accepted the cost of ambiguity. He stepped into a space where motives would be questioned and intentions misread, knowing that silence might have been easier. That choice will likely remain one of the most quietly defining moments of his life, not because of its public impact, but because of what it demanded internally. The broader lesson, if there is one, does not belong exclusively to these two men. It belongs to anyone who has ever struggled to reconcile personal loyalty with public responsibility. To anyone who has watched a familiar figure fall and wondered how much of what they believed was real. To anyone who has faced the uncomfortable truth that compassion does not always arrive in tidy, socially acceptable forms. There is a temptation to frame this story as a cautionary tale or a moral test, but doing so risks stripping it of its humanity. This is not a story about heroes or villains. It is a story about people navigating pressure, fear, and uncertainty with imperfect tools. About relationships formed in ordinary moments and tested under extraordinary scrutiny. About the quiet courage it can take to act without guarantees, knowing that understanding may never come. In the end, what lingers most strongly is silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence that follows when the noise recedes and reflection begins. It is in that silence that the real questions emerge. How do we judge others when we only see fragments of their lives? How do we support accountability without abandoning empathy? Where do we draw the line between standing by someone and standing for something larger than ourselves? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They are meant to stay with us, to surface in other contexts, other stories, other lives. They ask for patience, the same kind of patience required to restore something fragile without breaking it further. They ask for humility, an acknowledgement that certainty is often an illusion we cling to for comfort. As this chapter closes, the story does not truly end. It remains open, shaped by future events, personal reckonings, and the evolving ways we choose to interpret it. What you take from it will depend on your own experiences, your own values, and the questions you're willing to ask yourself. Perhaps that is its final legacy, not a conclusion, but an invitation to reflect, to disagree, to sit with complexity rather than rushing past it.